to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
My name is Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we begin, I just want to encourage everyone here and online to participate. If you're joining us online, you'll see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's your entrance point. Please give us questions, give us challenging questions. It's really an important part of the conversation we're going to have. And folks here, we're going to be passing out cards that you can write the questions down on. In addition, if you're joining us online, you'll see at the bottom next to that Q&A button, a closed caption button, so you can get that service as well. Our guest for today's program, speaking up, is Pamela Paul. Ms. Paul is a columnist from the New York Times. She was previously editor of the New York Times Book Review. And before that, was a journalist for The Economist and other publications. She's written and edited 8 books. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Today's program is really going to focus on speech. We're going to talk about dissent, protest, and the range of conversations we can have today. We're going to get into specific topics, but we're not going to delve deeply into any specific topic. And I want to start just to kind of get us going here on one of your columns a few years ago on American Dirt, which is a fast-paced novel. It's about a Mexican mother and son who crossed the border to escape from a murderous cartel. The initial reception was rave. There was just a lot of excitement. The initial reviews were terrific. And then the backlash started. And it started by one fairly harsh online review, which was picked up. And the main criticism against the author, Janine Cummins, was that she wasn't an immigrant, she wasn't a Mexican, and therefore the book lacked a legitimacy, that she wasn't qualified to be writing about this topic. Why did you write this story?
So as you mentioned, I spent 11 years at the New York Times Book Review before becoming an opinion columnist. And so I had been involved in the coverage of this book. And there were some things that had happened behind the scenes. As the editor of the book review, I wasn't reporting on them myself. I was overseeing the reporting, some of it indirectly, because we also had an editor who handled news stories and editors who handled the actual editing of reviews. And I felt that the full story hadn't been told, and that some of the underlying issues hadn't been fully explored. So there were a number of things in the circumstances of the criticism that really bothered me. One was that, as reported, this was fully a story of what's called cultural appropriation, which is a term that I think is used without people fully understanding necessarily what it always means. But it's one that I think is rarely explored critically from a kind of philosophical or literary standpoint. So if you look at the term cultural appropriation and you apply it to the idea of journalism, for example, the idea that someone needs to be a member of a group in order to write about it with any sense of authority or authenticity, then what are we doing as reporters? Because the whole idea of being a reporter is that you are coming from an outside perspective and then speaking to people who are often involved in very complicated situations. So it would be like saying, well, not to bring up another very controversial thing, but just in the context of Minneapolis, it would be like, we're going to describe the murder of George Floyd, but in order to talk about that, we're only going to talk to police. And because this is a crime story, you know, and then that would, of course, not capture the full sense of that story. And what you're doing as a reporter is you are taking all of these voices in, you're trying to represent them as best you can factually, and then allow the person, the reader, then to decide. And what reporters are doing, and often at the Times, one of the things that differentiates the Times from other news organizations is that whereas at some papers you might have someone who covers interest rates and they do it for 30 years, at the Times they deliberately switch people's beats, because the idea is that if you're reporting on a beat too closely for too long, you lose perspective of where everyone else is, you assume things that the reader isn't aware of, and you get too close to your sources. So you start to, you know, perhaps unconsciously represent certain points of view. So for example, my former colleague, Frank Bruni, who was an opinion columnist, he now writes a newsletter for the Times. He spent time as a campaign reporter. He was the Rome bureau chief. He was the food critic. And he was in Washington. And then he eventually became an opinion columnist where he covered a whole range of topics. And that was considered to be an advantage. So this is getting a little bit far away, but I think brings up some larger issues, which is to say that I don't think that there is any right or wrong person to tell any story. There is only different ways and different points of view to tell a story. So it would have been interesting to have, let's say, a Mexican immigrant write that novel, but it's also interesting to have someone who is not a Mexican immigrant write that novel. And Janine Cummins is 1/4 Puerto Rican. She's what, you know, many people would refer to as a white passing Latina, but she considers herself Latina. She was very close to her grandparent, who is from Puerto Rico. And more importantly, she felt like this was a story that she wanted to tell. And so one of the factual things that had been gotten wrong by much of the media is that this idea was, oh, you know, because she was white passing or white, the publisher put all their money and energy behind this book. And they gave her the kind of promotion that other books don't get. And I had been a year earlier at Book Expo, which was then the annual conference for the publishing industry, and I went around, as I often did, asking librarians and bookstore buyers, the people who decide which books to stock and promote, what they were most excited about. And hands down, without a single exception, everyone said American Dirt. That is before the launch. That is way before. So that's just one thing. A second thing is that I saw in one case a review that was extremely positive, that the reviewer then, once that reviewer saw the negative feedback that was online, decide to pull back the praise because it was no longer going to look good for her, and that she was nervous about the reception that she would have of giving a glowing review. And I just thought that that was pure cowardice. And there were some people who had blurbed the book early on who continued to stand up for it. That included Sandra Cisneros, who still stands by it, and Ann Patchett, who is obviously a novelist and bookstore owner, and she also stood up for it. But those instances were really rare, and people just ran away from the book. So a few things I wanted to do with that story. One is I wanted to actually get factually at what happened. The second is I'm very interested in what I think of as the story after the story. So a lot of people look at journalists are interested in the TikTok, the story before the story. So you'll see in the Times, something will happen in the administration, and then the next day or a couple days after, you'll get like inside the 24 hours up to the point that Trump did X crazy thing. And that's like kind of like, how did this happen? I'm really interested in the story of what happens afterwards. One of the best examples that I think of that is a story that my colleague Jim Rutenberg did for the New York Times Magazine about, I think his name was Mark someone come up with me for the South Carolina businessman who said he was taking a hike in the Appalachians, but was secretly off with his, I'm sorry? Mark Sanford. And it was like years later, he caught up with Mark Sanford. And that's the kind of story that really interests me. I'm interested in, well, what happened to you years later? And I think that those stories really need to be told because things move so quickly right now with the internet and with social media backlash that it just like gets swept away in the news, and we never really find out what happens. And I think that long-term impact matters.
I want to come back to a word you just mentioned and comes through in a lot of your writing. The word is fear.
Yeah.
And in terms of American Dirt, part of your reporting was on the fear that went through the publishing industry. And you've talked about reviewers who pulled back and endorsers who pulled back. And you write that this fear now hangs over every step of a fraught process with questions over who can write what,
Yeah.
who should blurb, who can edit, permeating what feels like a minefield. And then you go on to talk about sensitivity readers and so forth. And I guess the question is, what does it mean for speech when you've got kind of a DMZ that's now being set up involving gender and ethnicity and race and ideology?
I mean, so many, that's a huge question. Well, I'll just start very specifically with the idea of within the publishing industry and within the media, what fear often means is I'm afraid of, one, inadvertently hurting someone. And in an age where, and I think we're all aware of this in workplaces, many DEI and HR programs say intent doesn't matter, impact does. So what that does is it removes any idea of like, well, I didn't mean to trip you. It's like, doesn't matter. You tripped me and I fell and I got hurt. And so that essentially makes anyone guilty if someone says they're guilty. And so no one wants to jeopardize their position by inadvertently harming or hurting someone else. And the whole idea around what constitutes harm and hurt has also changed and expanded. But I think that the fear that the fear goes by often a number of euphemisms. So one of the things we talk about again is sensitivity, right? But sensitivity, whether it's a sensitivity reader or a sensitivity read or someone being sensitive to someone and therefore curtailing what they say, is really a mask for safetyism, and it's a mask for fear. And what it does is, I think, threefold. One is it stops people from telling the actual truth of what happened. And then it prevents readers then and the public from knowing what actually happened. But I think thirdly, and I wish this were discussed more often, and the people who do discuss it are often attacked for saying it. But let's take the vulnerable party in any situation, whether it's a Black author or a Latino academic or whoever it might be. It's insulting to them to say that they don't deserve the same level of criticism that anyone else, and to assume that they cannot handle it. And so I really think that we have started to valorize vulnerability and sensitivity and harm over strength and fortitude and resilience. And I think that echoes out, across the culture, and it's especially visible in, places where there are young people like universities.
You have a particular focus on the left and liberals in various parts of
progressives. I'll make a distinction.
And what's interesting is on the right, you've got folks who are committed to banning books.
Yeah.
And among progressives, you've got the use of shaming.
Yeah.
As a way to discourage reading books or reading arguments or giving credence to arguments. Is this a real threat to our speech?
Yeah, this is like what sometimes we call like whataboutism in journalism circles. Like, well, how can you talk about this tiny little thing that's going on over here when Trump is destroying the world? And A few things I would say about that. And also just to say specifically around book banning, the left does ban books too. And they also engage in self-censorship, which is itself a form of banning, but they do ban books. I mean, Huckleberry Finn, for example, which I just read for the first time before reading Percival Everett's James. Has been banned for using the N-word and for trafficking in stereotypes of, Black slaves at the time and all other kinds of manner of crime. It used to be banned by the right because it was supposed to, was valorizing, poor behavior and law breaking and sort of crass language, but not racist language. So there are lots of examples of that happening. But I've lost track of what your actual question was. So one thing I would say that as a journalist for the New York Times, so for me specifically, I feel that, and I guess I'm joining another news organization on the news side, so I can't really say what my politics are. But at the Times, I made it very clear that I'm liberal. So it's still Friday. I'm still employed at the Times for the rest of the day. So I can say that. But I felt that as a liberal writing for a newspaper that is ostensibly an independent news organization and that is read across the spectrum, but largely read by people on the left, anything I have to say about the Trump administration, one, they already probably know and agree with, and there are lots of other journalists and opinion columnists saying that. Two, it doesn't really have any impact on the Trump administration directly for me to say how horrible Trump is. He doesn't read it. One time when I was the book review editor, I asked the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie to write a short story about any subject of her choice with regard to the election. And she did this amazing story about Melania Trump, reimagining her as Mrs. Dalloway in the Hours. And she had this like lesbian fantasy that Melania had in the bathtub and all this stuff. And I remember at the time, I talked to Dean Baquet and senior editors at the Times, like, we got to gird ourselves for a reaction from the Trump campaign. This is back in 2016 before the election, and no reaction, because of course he doesn't read the book review, and there's never been any reaction. But anyway, that is to say that I don't think that the Trump administration or Donald Trump are taking cues from anything that I would write on the editorial page, and it's not going to have any effect. What I do think is a more effective way to fight forces of reaction is to make sure that what I think of as my side is as strong and big and forceful and correct as possible. I mean, correct isn't the right word, but that we are best positioned, that we're in a position of strength. And for me, that means to make sure that there is a big tent, but also some kind of coherence around liberal ideas and democratic ideas in order to be a bulwark for the forces of good. And so for me, that meant saying, let's look at our own side here and call out forces of illiberalism on our own side, because it does us no good if every horrible thing that Trump does over here, we react in an equally opposite maximalist position over here that then alienates people on our own side and undermines the very principles for which we're fighting.
And actually, you've written about that. And one of your columns entitled, "Who You Call Conservative," starts out by pointing to progressive activists who accuse you of being on the other side. And the pushback you give is that the impact of this is to narrow the focus of acceptable discourse by Democrats and their allies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, Frank Bruni has written a book about this, The Age of Grievance. He's talked a lot about the purity tests on the left. And I think that there is a tendency to, on the left, to say, if you disagree with us by 1 millimeter on any one of the sort of hot button third rail issues, then you therefore must be, sort of sleeping with the enemy. And it is, I think, a totally counterproductive position, especially when some of those points that they want total fealty to are themselves illiberal positions that I think undermine liberal principles. And the other thing is that when we don't allow for that discourse, and some people talk about it in the center, and it does exist in the center, it also exists on the right in terms of like the non-Trumpers, the anti-Trumpers, the people who are still philosophically or politically conservative but non-MAGA. And it really also, but I think was less discussed, exists on the left among liberals. And if all of those groups sort of look at this landscape and think like, if I speak up, I'm going to be attacked, and are silent, then it distorts what we think of as the issues, because you can have someone on the left saying defund the police, and someone all the way on the right saying the police are always right, and everyone should be armed to the hilt, and they should police themselves. And there's most Americans don't agree with either of those positions. But if nobody is articulating them, then they aren't getting put forth into the public sphere. And again, I think it is the polarization that we're seeing on social media, that we're seeing in our politics, are exacerbated by this tendency to look at anyone who disagrees with any small part of either of those extremities as being evil. And basically then going after them wholesale, and trying to delegitimize them, not just on that one thing, but then finding other, supposed thought crimes that exist there.
You've spent quite a bit of time talking about where we are right now, universities and colleges. And in one of your columns, you said that the universities have to be careful not to fall into a trap. What's this trap that the universities have? Because it's, there's such a strong sentiment on campus, including at the Humphrey School, that it's incumbent on universities to take a moral stand on the issues of the day, particularly given the Trump administration's policies.
So big caveat, which is that I have not written on universities since this second Trump administration has sort of taken over. And so I haven't reported on what's going on. So that I wrote before that. And I'm going to just speak to some things that predate this recent Trump administration, simply because I haven't really looked at it as a journalist during this time. I think that the number one mission of a university is to do research and to educate a next generation of citizens and perhaps scholars. And so that's the ultimate mission of a university. And I do believe that institutional neutrality is probably the best course forward to help fulfill that particular mission. Universities, as we are now finding out, and as we know, they are run like big corporations. They're also largely publicly funded, so they are subject to outside forces, both from their donors and from the government. And if you want to avoid pressures that can exist in many different ways, not just what the Trump administration is doing now, then again, I think that institutional neutrality is the best course forward. It does not prohibit speech on the part of students and student-run organizations, as long as they are complying with the rules of the university, because again, this is a public university and it's different at private universities, and it differs state by state. But let's say at a private university, then that university establishes its own rules around freedom of speech. It's not the same as if you were in a workplace in a private company. So I think that the trap right now for universities is to be reactive to everything the Trump administration is doing, and to focus on that to the exclusion of attending to what that core mission is. And I think that freedom of speech and the fact that a lot of students are and faculty members no longer feel free to speech, I think that is what also gets in the way of the core mission. Because when I was at school and I went to a private university, very liberal, Brown University. The ways in which I learned best were through hearing students raise controversial points, having active debate. And I think I wrote about this in a column, but one of the things that disturbs me is the effort to silence or not platform a given speaker because people disagree with them. And for me, that just runs absolutely counter to what a university should be, which is I would want to hear every controversial speaker. When I was at Brown, Antonin Scalia came to speak, and to the best of my recollection, there were no protests about Antonin Scalia coming to campus, even though most students considered him to be, you know, an enemy. We were excited because we all thought we're going to take him down. I mean, people crammed into, I think it was Solomon Hall. It was standing room only because we, in our frankly pretty smug certainty and hubris, thought that, you know, we're so smart, we'll show him, and he wiped the floor with us. I mean, it was devastating. And because you want to believe that you can prove the other side wrong just by hearing them. And that, I thought, was one of the most powerful lessons that I had the entire time that I was at Brown, because I realized, like, it doesn't matter if you are right, if you cannot articulate and argue against someone. And the fact that that is now actively discouraged, that some people might say, well, look at this decision and that decision, it's offensive, it hurt me, it runs counter to my beliefs, and therefore that person shouldn't be there, is it's just shocking to me that anyone at a university would want to pay to learn somewhere and have that occur.
You know, I think a lot of people would probably be sympathetic to what you're saying, but then you get into the meat of it, and you've got these really, almost irreconcilable views about speech as frankly harmful. There are the Palestinian groups and Palestinian sympathizers who are appalled at the killing of folks in Gaza, approaching 50,000. And then you've got Jewish groups who feel as if they've been suppressed, threatened, and trying to sort out how you have free speech in a way that is not perceived or is not in actuality a threat has become, I think, a very difficult terrain to sort through.
Yeah. I mean, again, obviously these are very complicated issues, but I think that the ground rules that I think of as you fight speech with more speech, not by silencing, but by hearing other people out and then allowing time for equal response. I was at the University of Toronto last year speaking about these issues, and the protests had been going on, there'd been encampments, and I just thought, well, here we are, three of people on a panel, and we're all talking about how awful this is that no one is talking to one another. And I just thought, well, why can we not actually have representatives from the encampment, from the Hillel, have them all on a panel together to actually talk to one another, rather than having us talk about the fact that they aren't talking to one another. I think that and I do think that in general, the idea of speech as a form of harm is a harmful one. And there was a schoolyard taunt when I was growing up, and you could say, like, oh, it's very simplistic, but what you said was, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names can never harm me. And the idea was that, I'm tough, I'm strong. What you say is not going to hurt me. And if I believe in my position, then I will be able to fight back with my own words, or to argue back with my own words. And I just think that those general inclinations have really gone away.
So this is a very interesting topic. We could spend a lot of time on it. But if you look at the history of speech and the concept of free speech, it's gone through quite an evolution. And not that long ago, maybe 3 centuries ago, the idea of speech as harmful was the prevailing view. And it was because of the impact on someone's character. It was on threats to religious orders and other orders. So a lot of this has got really interesting and important historic roots. I want to move on to another topic because you have a real inclination for searching out topics of intense interest, and this is particularly around the issue of trans. And you've been part of a conversation about talking about gender as defined strictly in biological terms. And I'm curious, why did you engage in that? Why is it that writing from your perch at the Times, that this is the topic that you landed on? And yeah.
Okay, so one of the reasons is that I am really interested in language and even disagree with some of the language you use. So I would not say that gender is strictly in terms of biological sex. I would say that sex is defined strictly in terms of biological sex. And I think part of the problem, I mean, no one can get this right. Donald Trump has gotten it wrong, saying there are only two genders, which is wrong. Bill Maher got it wrong by saying Donald Trump says that there are only two sexes. The idea that gender and sex, we have become so confused even about what those two basic terms mean, to me is a symptom of the way in which language has been politicized and twisted in order to serve political ends. And so I get very, Orwell politics in the English language on this kind of thing. I don't think that gender is about two sexes. It used to be that sex and gender were used almost interchangeably. Gender was used to substitute for situations in which it might be confusing that you were talking about actual intercourse. And when you use the word sex, so you would use the word gender to make sure that people didn't have that confusion, or specifically to talk about gender as a social and cultural construct. And what happened with some of the kind of the philosophical theory around queer theory and around gender is that those terms were sort of redefined, and now people don't quite know what they're talking about.
I understand the point you're making. I didn't use the word sex. You've inserted that. My point is you've inserted yourself into this discussion about biological terms as a way to understand gender, and you've positioned it in terms of thinking about the rights of women.
Yeah. But so again, no, I don't think that I don't think of gender in terms of biological sex, just to be clear. I know this is confusing. When I think of gender as a cultural and social construct. Outside the idea of gender identity, which is separate, I think of gender as a social and cultural construct. What we are often talking about with gender are gender stereotypes or gender roles for men and for women, which is something that the feminist movement and the gay rights movement actively fought against because they were seen as, rightfully so, I think, confining in terms of what a man or a woman could be. When I talk about sex, I do believe that we have really muddied the waters in terms of even very basic scientific facts, like sex is binary, which it is.
You've been a big supporter of J.K. Rowling.
Yes.
On these issues.
Yeah.
Why?
So I support J.K. Rowling's right to speak out about the need for women's spaces and for women to be defined biologically as female. And the idea that, there are certain phrases that gender activists or believers like to use, which is, transgender women are women. Which are factually not true. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 5. What I would say, and again, choosing my words really carefully, because I do think that being very precise in your language, especially when you're writing for a general audience who is really confused about these things, is very important. What a transgender person is, or transgender woman is, for example, is someone who whether for whatever reason, and there are a number of causes for wanting to change your gender identity, wants to live in a female role. And that is very different from saying a transgender woman is a woman. And I do believe that none of this negates the right of transgender people to live without fear of discrimination or harm based on their gender identity. So what I find, and again, going back to those extremes we talked about, where if you move an inch, that suddenly you're transphobic or you're anti-trans just because you don't agree with every single philosophical position that, let's say the sort of most maximalist position on transgender issues takes, I think, again, really stifles conversation and debate around this issue. So we use terms like trans rights very loosely. And for many people, the term trans rights refers to, again, the rights that were established and reaffirmed by the Supreme Court in Bostock, which is that they should not be discriminated against based on their gender identity. And then some people will say, well, trans rights also includes not being able to use the birth name of any transgender person, but only being, and then in an, frankly, I think, really like Newt Gingrichian way, renaming it. I think of the estate tax being renamed the death tax to make it sound really awful. So birth name has been renamed dead name. And now it's considered to be anti-trans rights then to use the dead name or the birth name. And again, when you're a journalist and you're trying to say like who, what, when, and why to a reader, and you don't use someone's birth name when you're describing it because you're afraid of hurting the feelings of that person, which, by the way, not all transgender people, because they're not a homogenous group, are even opposed to. Some of them have no issue with it. It ends up leaving people in a place of confusion. And that's not what journalists are supposed to do. And I'll just give one tiny example. Jan Morris, of course, is one of the sort of, very early public figures who was openly transgender. And she, of course, was previously James Morris. And as James Morris climbed Mount Everest with Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary, there's no way that she would have ever been able to do that at that time, given when she was a woman. She just would not have had that ability to do that. And I was recently reading a book that she wrote about travels across Oman. She traveled across Oman when she was James in the company of the Sultan of Oman. And you read this book, and it's just factually impossible for her to have done that, given the role and treatment of women in Oman at that time as Jan Morris, nor would she have been able to do it as transgender Jan Morris. So, you're warping people's sense of reality when you obscure these facts. And so I'll get to your question, which is like, why did you write about this? It's because I think of myself as a reality-based person, just very factual and scientific. And I think that we have really confused people about what is factually going on here, because we've declared a whole range of things verboten to even discuss, and just kind of hoped that if you can't talk about it, then it's almost like it doesn't exist.
And I think that, to me, is one of the kind of cross-cutting themes in a lot of your writing. It's the fear to speak. And I see, across all these issues, the trans issues, the campus speech issues, and others, this kind of commitment to giving voice. So one of your columns about trans debates and rallying, you said that she's sticking up for those who have silenced themselves to avoid the job loss, public vilification, and threats to physical safety if they were to speak up.
Yes.
And that's the side you're on. The side of giving voice,
Yes.
of saying speech is.
Absolutely. I don't think that someone should be threatened with death for speaking up. And, one of the interesting, and again, here it's like horseshoe theory again, where, some people on the far left are co-opt some of the worst tactics of the Trumpian right. And it's really out of like textbook Goebbels. If you repeat a lie often enough, people will come to believe it. And if you, anyone who dissents, you need to silence them. And what so Rowling, it's almost like, it's this damned if you do, damned if you don't. So she spoke up and people said, well, why you, this wealthy white woman with all the power in the world, would you speak up? So she's attacked for speaking up because of her privilege, but it is precisely because of her privilege that she is able to speak up. And I think that she frankly did a public service, because anyone else who spoke up, including me, would be attacked, would be threatened with job loss, and sometimes did lose their jobs, would be vilified in social media, would have their families and livelihood threatened. And those are very real world consequences. And only someone like J.K. Rowling, who can afford private safety and who has the money to be able to sustain any hit that she takes financially as a result, can do it. And so I think that what she was trying to do, and in a much smaller way I was trying to do when the institution of the Times was behind me, was to speak up in order to enable other people who are not in positions of power and who cannot afford to speak up for what they believe. There was just an instance in the UK of an African immigrant nurse who was treating a urological in a urology department of a hospital, a biological man, for issues around his genitals, her genitals, and she is also a practicing Christian. In any case, she did not use the patient's preferred gender, and she was penalized for that in her workplace. And again, I just think that we have people like her need protection too.
Here's we've got a number of questions, as you can imagine. Here's one. Your work has contributed to the hostile and, in fact, life-threatening climate that the trans community faces.
Yeah, I don't see that at all. I think if anything, by opening up and being able to talk about these issues in a dispassionate way is helpful to everyone. And the idea that if something you write is then taken by quote unquote the other side, that therefore you are responsible for whatever that side does, is a really dangerous argument for a whole number of reasons. You can, for example, report on efforts in Myanmar to suppress the Rohingya, and then if someone in power, finds out that, reads that report and says, well, we need to suppress them even more then as a consequence of this, are you then responsible for those actions because you called out something that was actually happening? I don't think that's true. I mean, I remember when I wrote my second book before I was at the Times, that was about looking at pornography from the consumer end and interviewing men who had used pornography, women who'd used pornography, people, and this was purely in a heterosexual context, because I think it's a different argument with same-sex pornography. But in those contexts, children who'd been exposed to pornography, and talking to them about the ways in which, for men, for example, it had led to, it had detrimental effects on their own sexuality and their own relationships. That then was taken up by then Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, and I was in a writing group at the time, and everyone in the writing group was also on the left. And I said, well, Sam Brownback has asked me to go and testify before Congress. Like, I feel a little bit conflicted. And they said, look, Sam Brownback, because a lot of people in that group were foreign reporters and human rights workers, said he's really good and really strong on human rights issues in Africa and elsewhere. And you need to, if you align with him on an issue, then there's no reason why you shouldn't go. We align with him when it comes to human rights abuses abroad. And, again, I'm trying to do the work that I am doing as a journalist. I am not an activist. and I am not responsible for ways in which some people might misinterpret my work or distort it or use it for their own purposes.
Yeah, this questioner goes on to suggest that some of the policies that the Trump administration is pursuing in terms of rolling back the rights of trans have been enabled by your columns.
Yeah, I would just fundamentally disagree with that. I think that's factually inaccurate.
We've got a question here from one of our online folks saying, you mentioned the event with Antonin Scalia Brown. What is it that changed your mind?
Changed my mind generally?
Yeah, well, you said that this event had an impact because he was able to engage with critics. What was it? Was it the power of his thought, his intellect, his ability to present counter arguments?
I mean, the guy, it was an extremely talented lawyer with a incredible, he's a professional arguer and debater, and so he just was able to poke holes in all of the, what happened with the Brown students is and again, I didn't ask a question in that circumstance. I was way in the back, but is that there is this idea that if you know you are right and you're very emotional and passionate about it, that somehow it will come across. And what he showed is, it doesn't matter how right you think you are and how passionate you are, if you can't make an effective debating point, then you're going to lose the debate. And I think the other thing that I took away from that was that it really is only in debating someone with whom you forcefully disagree that you really figure out how to defend your own position. And that's what bothers me so much about university debate, because if you don't hear people who agree with you and who challenge you on your assumptions, then you're never going to know where you stand. In fact, before I wrote about gender, I reached out to a couple of transgender people who'd written often around transgender issues. And I said, listen, I want to have an off-the-record conversation with you before I touch this topic. And you never have to admit that you spoke to me, and I will never say that I spoke to you. But I want you to argue back at me. You might persuade me. I want you to show me where I am wrong. Because if I don't know how, if I can't find the hole, if you point to holes in my argument, then I'm not making a strong argument. And again, I'm always open to having my mind changed. I don't think I would have been as well grounded in making the arguments that I did or in doing the reporting I did if I hadn't spoken to those people. Because that's a lesson that I learned also before I came to the Times, because I think it's fairly public fact that I was married a long time ago to one of my colleagues at the Times, and he was and is very conservative. I think he's mended his ways somewhat and become more reasonable, but I was very liberal and still am. And we would have endless political debates. And it was really the first time that, because I didn't engage directly with Antonin Scalia at that event, that I ever spoke to anyone conservative and had them challenge me. And, so I remember there was once a magazine on the floor that was like, women should stay home after working. And I got so furious. I couldn't even believe that he had that magazine. Like, it didn't even matter if he read the article or not. And we had this really, strong debate over that issue. During the Whitewater, we got into a huge argument over Elie Wiesel, who was defending Clinton at the time, and my ex was criticizing Elie Wiesel. I mean, these are really interesting arguments to philosophically to get into, and I think that people and students in particular are impoverished when they don't have that opportunity. I always think, like, if I were editing an opinion section, I would say to editors every month, get 3 people whose views you absolutely and arguments disagree with and edit them. It'll make their pieces stronger and it'll make you stronger as an editor. It's like debate, just taking up a position that you don't agree with and having to make that argument. I think that's a learning experience.
Why do you think we're so uneasy with that? Because I agree with you. I think there is a fear.
Well, it's because we have confused people's opinions with their character, and we are painting in such broad strokes so that if someone has a wrong opinion, they therefore must be a bad and evil person. I mean, I thought one of the most interesting documentaries was Alexandra Pelosi, who is the daughter, of course, of Nancy Pelosi, went out and she interviewed a bunch of the January 6th insurrectionists and, painted this kind of full portrait. And she challenged them, but she talked to them. And she showed that, like, these are people who have their whole other lives. The other thing that I often keep in mind is the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, which, if you haven't read, is a really excellent book about wrongful conviction, about death row inmates. And he has a line in there which is, no one is the worst thing. You are not the worst thing you ever have done. And and it doesn't even have to be a terrible act. It could just be an opinion that you disagree with, but that does not define someone. And I think that we have gotten to a point where if I say something that, again, like whether it's on gender or on race or on Israel, Gaza, that someone disagrees with, they don't have any idea who I am as a person. And you can't just say like, well, I must be evil or uncaring or, lack compassion to write this. No, you simply disagree with that point, and let's talk about it on the merits. So I do think that in that kind of atmosphere, it's absolutely reasonable to be afraid, and you can suffer real world punishment. I mean, I remember when I was when one of the reasons I became an opinion columnist, I was the editor of the book review at the time, and that job I could have held on to. It was a great job, but one is I felt I started to feel complicit in my silence. But also I was speaking to a lot of my other writers I know, most of them women and all of them liberal, and saying, this is going on. We're having these conversations. Why aren't you writing about this? And they all had very reasonable reasons not to. Well, I can't do it because I have a book proposal out, or I can't do it because my child's applying to nursery school and like I don't want them to get blackballed, or I'm just too sensitive. I don't want to get hated on Twitter. Like my editors, my colleagues would all hate me. Those are all really reasonable human things. But we have helped create that atmosphere in which people suffer those kind of repercussions. And that is supposed to be from the tolerant left. And that's why, to get back to an earlier point, I feel like it is so important for me, for us on the left, to be real liberals, to model the tolerance that we would like to see from, the other side, which again, right now I don't know how possible that is.
You've talked about the importance of speech in terms of advancing our knowledge and truth, and this is an old idea. John Stuart Mills is famous for this argument that we need to have our ideas tested, and that through that testing and debate, we get to really have some purchase on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. And obviously that's important in a university. And so if you've got limited speech, it's going to impair your ability to pursue truth. But there's another argument that you've made, which is there's a fundamental liberty in being able to speak your mind.
Yeah.
And your kind of farewell column, you said we should never refrain from speaking what we believe, even if it hurts, even if it offends, even if it damages other people.
I think that, again, that which does not kill me makes me stronger, and speech should offend people sometimes. It should hurt. It should, if not everyone is going to like what you say, and not everyone is going to like you as a person. And for a people pleaser like myself, it's a hard lesson to come to eventually. But honestly, if you're saying anything, one of my fellow columnists said to me, like, if you say something and no one has any reaction, then why did you write? You're saying things and people are either going to disagree or agree. I also do think, though, that we confuse being hurt with disagreeing, that we are confusing an emotional reaction with an intellectual disagreement. And I also think that silence hurts us. I think silence hurts the individual who is silenced, and I also think it hurts everyone else, because if you cannot air different points of view, if you cannot challenge people, if you cannot make mistakes or other people make mistakes in their own assumptions, then you cannot learn, you cannot grow. I mean, it's this thing that we always hear about, the value of a scraped knee, or, you know, you learn through your mistakes. Like, that is how people learn. And one of the things that I do think is an unstated cause of the widespread youth mental health crisis and anxiety on campuses and in high schools is this feeling of being silenced. I mean, your adolescence and your young adulthood are times to take risks and to test out ideas and to be able to speak up and not be punished for it. And I think that especially in the age of social media, like what, you know, would have been, I mean, I think back, I remember a woman on campus like stumbling so drunkenly on campus, and it was so embarrassing for her the next day. But there weren't that many people who saw, and no one filmed it, no one put it on social media because those things didn't exist. And that's the atmosphere that we're all living in today, is that anything that you ever say or do will be enshrined indefinitely in people's minds on the internet and held against you. And I think that that inability then to speak up is really harmful. It causes it. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been, I'm sure all of you have been in some situation where you've had to bite your tongue and not felt good about it. And that can be biting your tongue when someone says something racist, but you feel like, oh my God, it was my boss and I can't call them out on it. Otherwise I could be retaliated against, or, you know, seeing someone mistreat a younger employee, whatever it might be. It hurts to be silenced when you see injustice. And I have 3 teenage children, 2 of whom are college age. And when I say something, you know, one of my kids might say, oh my God, you can't say that. And I feel really bad that that's the first instinct.
So what would you, I mean, here we are at a university where you've got students who are hypersensitive to social groups, they're hypersensitive to their professors who, may not be as tolerant as you are. What's your advice to them? How do they handle the fear? Because we've been talking about fear. We've been very clear about what that looks like and the tangible nature of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a vicious circle, really. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the people who are afraid to speak are, you know, they're afraid for themselves. They're afraid for hurting someone else. The people who are saying that they're being hurt by whatever that person might have been said, they are also using, again, that word sensitivity. But I think that we're misplacing where our values should be. And I would say to the people who are sensitive to something that they might deem offensive as speech, if you have more confidence, and have more resilience. If you believe truly in your position, then whatever that person says that might hurt you, if you have a counter argument and you have confidence in it, then just fight back with your own words, articulate what your own position is in response. If you believe strongly, let's say you are a pro-Palestinian protester and you believe strongly in the rightness of your cause, then don't focus on the on things that people might say. And I would say the same thing for, you know, Jewish students too. Again, as long as none of this speech crosses the lines of what universities have deemed to be appropriate speech on campus, but argue back. And rather than prioritize something that you and think of something that someone else says as something that is offensive or hurtful, think of it as something wrong that you might then shed light on through your own speech.
You wrote a column a while back about campus speech, and you said one of the things that's been lost is listening. And you kind of, towards the close, you say, is it worth letting someone speak if some students consider that person's views objectionable, even abhorrent? But another question to ask is, what gets lost if we don't let that person speak?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, like this is journalistic instinct and practice, but I think that it holds true for every aspect of life. If you're seated next to, like, let's say you're at a dinner and you think like, oh my God, I'm sitting next to the most boring people. I always think like, no one is boring. Everyone is interesting. Everyone has some kind of interesting story. I mean, if you've ever taken a personal writing or a memoir class, it's fascinating, like just the randomness. Everyone has some crazy thing that's happened in their life that they want to write about. And you think, wow, everyone has a story. And your job is to just ask questions and find out what that person's story is. And if you are shocked by what someone says, then it's really interesting to just keep saying, well, why? Or like, why do you think that? I mean, I feel like it is such a loss that some people, let's say on an issue that they deem my views so abhorrent that they aren't even willing to speak to me. Let's say someone who is transgender, I would welcome the opportunity, just as I did with those people before I even wrote about it, to ask questions, because that's how you learn.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask.
I repeated myself too.
I want to ask you to do some reporting on your own experience at the Times, where you've been for quite a number of years, and where you've kind of had a powerful platform, because you experienced, as your column developed and as you got a following and then significant pushback, a really striking demonstration of the power of activists in our age, using online, using the vulnerability of news organizations to hold their subscribers, the focus on getting the attention of the wandering eyeball, getting people to click on the stories. How would you describe as a reporter what you saw at the Times, and what are the lessons for us now?
Well, so one thing is that people say like, oh, you got all this pushback. And I do think, again, this is part of the distorting power of social media. And a lot of reporting often tends to take its cues from social media. So this is why I think it's so necessary for voices across the spectrum to be loud, because otherwise you take the loudest voices in the room as the most powerful or dominant. The people on social media who activated against me and the activists are really a very small group of people, and they don't represent our readers because, again, most people aren't speaking out. Even if you look at the comments of my columns, which were largely supportive, only about 1% of Times readers even writes comments on any given story. So that's not the readers either. And what was important to me is that I also got, again, a lot of very powerful support, often private. And I thought to myself, I want those people to be able to not just issue support of me, but to articulate their own views and their own experiences out loud. For example, one of the groups, when I wrote about gender, that is most silenced are the parents of children who are gender dysphoric or trans-identified as youths. And they feel that they are not able to speak out loud about their children's comorbidities they might have, their mental health condition, family circumstances that are going on, anything other than to outright support their child's own self-diagnosis or self-identifying as trans, or they'll be silenced. And that's terrible, because if you're a parent and you're trying to do what's right by your child and you are not able to speak out to friends, to other parents, to healthcare providers openly, for healthcare providers not to be able to speak openly because they can lose their job from their accrediting associations, which have largely been captured. I think that, again, it gets back to to get back to your question, my reporting on my own experience shows the value of continuing to report about uncomfortable or difficult or complicated issues, because we will not, people will not understand those complexities if we don't report on them, and they will also not be able to come to their own position if they aren't given views that they either agree with or disagree with, but that aren't on the extremes.
Maybe they won't speak out.
Yeah, yeah.
Pamela Paul, thank you so much. Thank you
Thank you.
for being with us. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for being someone who put a flashlight on the different topics that we try to avoid. So
I'll
thank
keep
you
doing
very much.
it. Thank you.
Just a couple quick closing comments. Want to give you a heads up. We've got a terrific conversation coming up with Jake Sullivan, who was President Biden's national security advisor, also a Minnesotan. He'll be here June 5th to be talking about the accomplishments and some of the challenges coming out of the Biden administration and where we are today. Those of you who know Jake Sullivan, this is an unusually brilliant person who will be speaking, I think, truth. So please come to that either live or on Zoom. Also want to give you a shout out. We've got an incredible program that Walter Mondale started. Vin Weber and Tim Penny ran it for a dozen years, and I've been running with my colleague Sarah Benskofer. It's called the Humphrey Policy Fellows. It's been around for 35 years. And there's going to be a celebration Wednesday, July 16th at 5:30 at McNamara Alumni Center. Please feel free to come. We're welcoming people to that. It's really an extraordinary program. Want to let you know that this conversation will be up and available as a podcast in 1 to 2 days. Look under a dialogue across difference or Humphrey School and you'll see it. And feel free to share it with other people. Finally, these programs require resources. If you're so inclined, please feel free to make a contribution. It'll allow us to continue this work. Finally, once again, thank you, Pamela Paul.
Thank you.